Hi everyone, welcome to Katie Mack Comments, a channel where I, Katie Mack, comment. But in all seriousness, here on my channel we discuss social justice issues, pop culture, and feminism, all from the lens of my psychology and women's studies degrees, so if any of that interests you, be sure to click the subscribe button down below. Today, we're going to be talking about JK Rowling and her transphobia, which she attempts to hide under the guise of feminism, which is also known as trans-exclusionary radical feminism. So, I'm sure you're wondering, what exactly is trans-exclusionary radical feminism? Well, first, I'll tell you what it's not, and that's feminism. The idea that one can be a feminist, but only fight for certain women to have rights is just plain false. It's not feminism if it's not intersectional. In the same way that people have been explaining why transphobia isn't welcome in the Black Lives Matter movement because all Black Lives Matter, transphobia isn't welcome in feminism either. Picking and choosing who can and cannot have rights does not make you a feminist. It makes you just as bad as those oppressing you because now you're oppressing others. TERFs, or trans-exclusionary radical feminists, like to call themselves gender critical. However, in my opinion, we should just call them what they are, transphobes. The definition of transphobia is irrational fear of, aversion to, or discrimination against transgender people. And it can show up in a lot of different ways. In an interview conducted by New Statesman, feminist scholar Judith Butler discusses how trans-exclusionary radical feminists often claim that the term TERF is a slur, and she pushes back on that, saying, "I am not aware that TERF is used as a slur. I wonder what names self-declared feminists who wish to exclude trans women from women's spaces would be called. If they do favor exclusion, why not call them exclusionary? If they understand themselves as belonging to that strain of radical feminism that opposes gender reassignment, why not call them radical feminists?" Today, I will be discussing JK Rowling's transphobia and why her taking the stance so publicly is very detrimental to the trans rights movement. JK Rowling has tweeted a slew of transphobic comments, so let's take a look at a few of them. First, she tweeted an article with the headline, "Opinion, Creating a More Equal Post-COVID-19 World for People Who Menstruate," and commented, "People who menstruate. I'm sure there used to be a word for those people. Someone help me out. Wumben? Wimpund? Woomud?" So she's obviously trying to get us to think women here, but there are lots of people who menstruate who aren't women. Trans men, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people also may menstruate. So using the term women in this article would just make less logical sense than saying people who menstruate. It's also a more correct and logical term because not all women menstruate. Some women never have, and some have stopped menstruating. So saying that women is an all-encompassing term for people who menstruate is simply not factual. Next, she tweets, "If sex isn't real, there is no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. I know and love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives. It isn't hate to speak the truth." So first of all, no one is claiming that sex isn't real. People are just finally understanding that sex isn't the end-all and be-all of a person's identity. Also, the assertion that the lived reality of women globally would be erased is just not true. Especially considering that identifying as a woman is identifying as a gender identity, not a sex. And if a sentence ever starts with, "I know and love trans people, but," then you know they're about to say some transphobic. Trans people aren't asking for the concept of sex to be erased. In fact, no one is asking for that. Trans activists just want people to understand that sex isn't the only thing that matters when talking about reproductive rights and menstrual habits. Then she tweets, "The idea that women like me, who have been empathetic to trans people for decades, feeling kinship because they're vulnerable in the same way as women, i.e. male violence, hate trans people because they think sex is real and has lived consequences, is a nonsense. I respect every trans person's right to live any way that feels authentic and comfortable to them. I'd march with you if you were discriminated against on the basis of being trans. At the same time, my life has been shaped by being female. I do not believe it's hateful to say so. She claims that she's been empathetic to trans people for decades, and yet she continues to spew transphobic rhetoric and publicly support other transphobic people. Again, no one is saying that sex isn't real. We're just acknowledging that gender is real too, and has many more real-life consequences than the genitalia in your pants do. Rowling goes on to say that she'd march with trans people if they were discriminated against on the basis of being trans, as if that doesn't happen every single day. She's simultaneously erasing the lived experiences of all trans people by claiming that they aren't discriminated against for being trans. And then she comes back with the whole, I love trans people, but tactic, except this time she says, at the same time. She says her life has been shaped by being female, and while I do believe that that's true, I think she's underrepresenting the amount that being a woman has shaped her life. While having a vulva certainly does come with specific experiences based around having that vulva, most people don't know what genitalia you possess just from looking at you. What they can see is your gender presentation, which JK Rowling has so clearly identified as womanhood. While it's not hateful to say that having a vulva or being female has shaped your life in some ways, it's false to claim that all gendered experiences you've had have been because of your genitalia. So now we get to Rowling's 3,696-word transphobic essay that she wrote in response to the backlash she received for these tweets. While I won't be going over every sentence in her essay, I've pulled some of the most flagrantly transphobic passages to debunk for you all. It's been clear to me for a while that the new trans activism is having, or is likely to have if all its demands are met, a significant impact on many of the causes I support because it's pushing to erode the legal definition of sex and replace it with gender. I don't understand where she's getting her information about trans activism, because I've never heard any trans people or trans allies pushing to replace the legal definition of sex with gender. I feel like she just wants to make shit up to make her argument sound less transphobic, because she can't actually find any real points to make her sound less transphobic. I'm concerned about the huge explosion in young women wishing to transition, and also about the increasing numbers who seem to be detransitioning, returning to their original sex, because they regret taking steps that have, in some cases, altered their bodies irrevocably and taken away their fertility. The topic of detransitioning is something that JK and other transphobes love to bring into the conversation, because this makes people believe that detransitioning is something that happens often. While some people do detransition, it was found in a 2015 survey ran by the National Center for Transgender Equality that only about 8% of all trans people detransition. It was also found that the most common reasons cited for detransitioning are pressures from others such as family members and spouses, harassment and discrimination suffered for transitioning, and having trouble finding a job. Not only is detransitioning rare, but it is also almost never because the person detransitioning wants to. The idea of detransitioning is often brought up by transphobes to paint trans people as acting irrationally out of confusion about their gender, when the truth is, trans people who want to transition are almost always happier after transitioning and affirming their gender. The writings of young trans men reveal a group of notably sensitive and clever people. The more of their accounts of gender dysphoria I've read, with their insightful descriptions of anxiety, dissociation, eating disorders, self-harm, and self-hatred, the more I've wondered whether, if I'd been born 30 years later, I too might have tried to transition. The allure of escaping womanhood would have been huge. I struggled with severe OCD as a teenager. If I'd found community and sympathy online that I couldn't find in my immediate environment, I believe I could have been persuaded to turn myself into the son my father had openly said he'd have preferred. So here JK is trying to claim that because she suffered from mental illnesses when she was young, that if she had been young in 2020, she would have transitioned. She completely ignores the fact that trans people also experience gender dysphoria, defined by Psychology Today as strong, persistent feelings of identification with another gender and discomfort with one's own assigned gender and sex, which is one of the most important factors of transness. Trans people don't just become trans because they don't like themselves, as JK seems to imply. Real trans people don't identify with the gender that was involuntarily assigned to them as an infant, and therefore experience gender dysphoria, which often prompts desires to transition. I also find it rather troublesome that she claims so casually that she would transition, as if transitioning is such a simple, easy, and accessible thing to do. A man who intends to have no surgery and take no hormones may now secure himself a gender recognition certificate and be a woman in the sight of the law. Many people aren't aware of this. There's a lot of transphobia packed into this one sentence, but let's start off with her assertion that a person who would want a gender recognition certificate to be recognized as a woman is actually a man. Rowling is using this wording to assert that people who are not gender dysphoric would be able to easily change their gender in the eyes of the law to, as transphobic people often claim, be allowed into women's spaces, such as women's bathrooms. As a person who has many trans friends and has watched many people go through the steps to be recognized as their correct gender, I can tell you it's not that easy. The rhetoric of an easy transition that requires little to no documentation is completely false, because at the very least, you would need documentation of persistent gender dysphoria. With some simple Googling, it was easy to find that her claims about the UK gender recognition certificate aren't completely truthful, as it clearly states on the official government website that minimum requirements for a certificate include documented gender dysphoria and living in your gender for at least 2 years. TERFs want you to believe that any man on the street could just claim he was a woman and immediately legally be documented as such, but in reality, this simply doesn't happen. She also describes someone who doesn't intend to have surgery or take hormones as someone whose transness isn't valid, as if the only way you could be trans is by altering your body. Many trans people don't want to alter their body in any way, but that doesn't make them any less who they identify themselves to be. Trans people don't have to surgically or hormonally change their body to be valid, and Rowling's assertion that they do is transphobic and, quite frankly, ignorant. But, as many women have said before me, woman is not a costume. No one is claiming that woman is a costume. In fact, trans people are actually arguing the complete opposite. Trans people are not wearing costumes. They're living as their true identity in a world that's trying as hard as possible to convince you otherwise. The transphobic rhetoric that Rowling leans on to convince people that trans women are just men in costumes is not only wildly incorrect, but also extremely offensive. Moreover, the inclusive language that calls female people menstruators and people with vulvas strikes many women as dehumanizing and demeaning. I understand why trans activists consider this language to be appropriate and kind, but for those of us who've had degrading slurs spat at us by violent men, it's not neutral, it's hostile and alienating. So she says that inclusive language is dehumanizing to women, even though the inclusive language is literally people with vulvas or people who menstruate. Like, how is it dehumanizing when the priority of the phrases are that they're people? Rowling then writes, but for those of us who've had degrading slurs spat at us by violent men, as if trans people, especially trans women, are not persistently harassed and attacked on the street by violent men. As a cisgender woman, I'm offended by her assertion that cis women have it harder than trans women. This isn't a competition over who's the most oppressed. This is about recognizing the fact that just because you're oppressed doesn't mean that other people aren't also oppressed for different reasons than you. Your oppression doesn't cancel out anyone else's. And quite frankly, it's hostile for her to be claiming that she has it harder than others in this way. I'm not saying that she hasn't been oppressed, but I am saying that as a straight, white, cisgendered woman, she cannot play this "but I've been oppressed more than you" card. So I want trans women to be safe. At the same time, I do not want to make natal girls and women less safe. When you throw open the doors of bathrooms and changing rooms to any man who believes or feels he's a woman, and, as I've said, gender confirmation certificates may now be granted without any need for surgery or hormones, then you open the door to any and all men who wish to come inside. That is the simple truth. First of all, it's extremely important to acknowledge that making trans women safe doesn't make cisgender women any less safe. I also find it interesting that she uses the word natal instead of cisgender, because as someone who claims to have done extensive research on gender and trans studies, she doesn't seem to know the conventional terminology. She then goes on to, once again, use the transphobic rhetoric of men being able to easily access women's changing rooms and bathrooms, when that is simply not the case. We've already proven earlier that her claims about easily obtaining gender confirmation certificates are completely false, but the idea that cisgender men will use these inclusive laws and regulations to abuse women is 100% unfounded and can easily be proven wrong. As I briefly touched on in my video about WAP, trans people's rights to use public bathrooms are being twisted into this moral panic to displace social anxieties about assault onto trans people, who, might I add, are the most at risk for assault. Gail Rubin, the scholar who coined the phrase moral panics, explains how, because sexuality, or in this case gender, in Western societies is so mystified, the wars over it are often fought at oblique angles, aimed at phony targets, conducted with misplaced passions, and are highly, intensely symbolic. So while these people claim to be worried about assault in bathrooms, they're really just transphobic and trying to hide that transphobia behind claiming that it's all about women's and children's safety in bathrooms. In a Vox article entitled "Anti-Transgender Bathroom Hysteria Explained," the author writes, "Moreover, there's no evidence that non-discrimination laws and other policies that also let trans people use the bathroom for their gender identity lead to sexual assault in bathrooms and locker rooms. In 2 investigations, Media Matters confirmed with experts and officials in 12 states and 17 school districts with protections for trans people that they had no increases in sex crimes after they enacted their policies." In the New Statesman interview with feminist scholar Judith Butler, she explains that the feminist who holds such a view presumes that the penis does define the person, and that anyone with a penis would identify as a woman for the purposes of entering such changing rooms and posing a threat to the woman inside. It assumes that the penis is the threat, or that any person who has a penis who identifies as a woman is engaging in a base, deceitful, and harmful form of disguise. This is a rich fantasy, and one that comes from powerful fears, but it does not describe a social reality. Time magazine even found that the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence signed a letter agreeing that this argument is false, stating, "As rape crisis centers, shelters, and other service providers who work each and every day to meet the needs of all survivors and reduce sexual assault and domestic violence throughout society, we speak from experience and expertise when we state that these claims are false." The reality of assaults in bathrooms should be more of a reason to pass inclusive bathroom laws, because forcing trans people into the bathroom that corresponds with their gender they were assigned at birth actually puts trans people at way greater risk. Imagine a trans woman walking into a men's bathroom. That puts her at way greater risk than if she had gone into the women's restroom. If anything, these discriminatory laws are forcing men into women's bathrooms, because trans men are being forced to use women's bathrooms even though they're men. Trans men are men, and forcing them into women's bathrooms means forcing men into women's bathrooms. Now, I could sit here all day and give you data on how trans people's bathroom rights don't put anyone in danger, but I still have other transphobic remarks from JK Rowling to get to. The rest of her essay is just as transphobic as the rest, and I'll link it down below for those of you who want to read it in its entirety. But I can't make this video without also discussing JK Rowling's newest book, which contains another unfortunate attempt to justify her transphobia. The book centers around a detective investigating a cisgender man who is a serial killer, who dresses up like a woman to kill his victims, who are all cisgender women. Unsurprisingly, people are mad about this obvious attempt to justify transphobia. As one Twitter user says, "People want gender variance to be villainous. Horror movies are so used to gender variance equals grotesque equals evil. Note how oversized the trope is in media and how aimed at queerness it is. People want to show gender variance as violent to deflect from the violence of gender conformity." A review of the book from Telegraph even states that it's a book whose moral seems to be never trust a man in a dress. Kat Black, a YouTuber and trans activist, tweeted in response to the book, "LOL, she literally has to make up stories to justify her position. Her obsession with us is so strange. I don't even think your standard issue transphobe puts this much effort into it." She goes on to write, "I really appreciate her being less coy about her transphobia, though. I'll remind you all once again, trans people who spent most of their lives taking hormones and getting surgery are very aware of what their biology is. The disconnect is how they know they're trans. And transgender people will always be in more danger around cis people than vice versa. Most trans folks live at the behest of their cis counterparts, so when they weaponize transphobia, it hits hard, very hard, and folks like JK Rowling know this." She concludes her thoughts by saying, "JK Rowling could have just not done all of this, and her trans fans, there are lots, would have continued to support her. I'm glad she's being honest about it. You really can't write a 900-page transphobic fantasy and then say, I'm not transphobic. Also, can I also say that this story has been done to death? This is one of the most classic transphobic tropes ever." Monroe Bergdorf, another trans activist, tweeted, "The reality is that trans people exist, we have always existed, and will always exist. In goading and fanning the flames of a traumatizingly toxic debate over our right to exist in public spaces, she has been doing so all along with the view of flogging for this book. Hate for profit. The reality is that trans people are more likely to be murdered than commit murder. The reality is that trans people are already navigating a hostile environment worldwide, and this only adds to that hostility. JK Rowling is dangerous." The director of transgender representation at the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, Nick Adams, explains that gender expression isn't a danger to others. These false narratives put real transgender and gender nonconforming people in harm's way. Trans people are not dangerous. JK Rowling's public transphobia, however, is dangerous. She continues to spew hateful and incorrect narratives while passing them off as truthful, which is incredibly harmful to trans people and their rights to live their lives in public spaces. Rowling is a TERF whether she wants to believe it or not, because she continues to intentionally spread misinformation and fan the flames of the moral panic over trans rights. That's it for this video, but before I go, I want to remind you to check the links in the description box down below for places to donate, sign petitions, and learn about the Black Lives Matter movement, and how to support Black trans people. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you've made it this far, comment JK Rowling is a TERF down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!